and welcome to another episode of Fast Forward. I'm your host, John Pomeranz, and our guests today are Judith Eckerson and Scott Edelman. Thank you both for coming.
You're welcome.
Judith, I was glad we were able to get you today. We're taping this on a Sunday, and you're a minister in real life, so I'm glad that your other duties didn't interfere.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to be here. But I consider science fiction to be real life, too.
Okay. Well, then, while we're here talking about both of your real lives, then, I wonder how it is that a nice minister like you got into a business like this.
Well, actually, I guess I was a writer long before. I don't know how much detail you want about
well, when did you first start reading or writing science fiction?
Well, I have a hard time distinguishing science fiction as a category from other kinds of writing. I think I decided to be a writer before I could write. And my first story, I guess I was about 6 years old when I wrote it. It was about a little girl who found a universe that was very strange and different from what was outside under her front porch. And this story had an uncanny resemblance to Alice in Wonderland. So I sort of drifted right into it as a child.
Were you a big reader as a child? Mm-hmm. What sort of things did you read? Well, had you read Alice in Wonderland?
Yes,
Was it deliberate plagiarism? Uh-oh.
Yes.
Well, I won't tell
Certainly.
Lewis Carroll if you don't.
And my father was a science fiction reader and talked to me a great deal about it.
Scott, what about you?
Well, I think I have a relative to thank as well. I had an uncle who would come visiting every Sunday. He would usually bring 5 or 6 copies of the magazines that were being published at that time in science fiction, analog, and so forth, and he would bring the books that were coming out. So I have to thank him for giving me Stranger in a Strange Land and so forth. He was able to give me the books that were far beyond my budget as a 7, 8, 9-year-old. He's really the one I have to thank for that, and I can remember buying Fantastic Four #1 when I was 6 years old, so I think
the comic book,
right. That's right. So that's really one of the 2 things that I think contributed to my being a voracious reader and getting hooked into science fiction and fantasy and you know, things that happen that don't quite happen that way in the real world.
Right. I know actually you mentioned comic books that in addition to writing straight science fiction and fantasy, you also do comic work, or were an editor?
Well, my first job in the adult world was to work for Marvel Comics. I was what they call an associate editor there. I worked on some of the comic books that came out in Britain, and I wrote Captain Marvel for a while. I ended up getting away from that. I haven't done any comic book work since 1980. I've been working entirely on prose, pure text, because I don't work well with collaborators, whether they're drawing the pictures or telling me what to do with the words. So that's why I've shifted away from that. And I have a real-time job as well, only I work at a bank. So God and money, that's us together, I guess.
So then you went from Marvel to writing on your own?
Well, up until about 1980, I think what basically happened to me is that I realized that I didn't want anyone to mess with my words. And if you're doing commercial work, writing for comic books, I did some work for Hanna-Barbera and animated Saturday morning cartoon shows and so forth. And I actually had a couple episodes of Tales from the Dark Side, if you've seen that.
The anthology TV series,
on,
that is. Right.
Usually late Saturday nights. And the thing is, I don't like people messing with me. And if you're working for TV or if you're working for a comic book company, people mess with you all the time. So I decided I would get a job that had nothing to do with words, so I could keep my my writing separate as a spiritual part of my life that is mine alone, and it's worked so far.
It's definitely a very sort of hermit-like profession. Judith, I wonder, when you write, is that true with you, or do you find a lot of input?
Oh yes, I think writing is the work of a hermit. In fact, I have thought from time to time that people who write are possibly the same sort of people who would shove a note under somebody's door and run away. Because when you write, you're doing it in an entirely different time and place from the time and place of the reader.
Does that change what you would say? I mean, is there something about writing that gives you a freedom that some other more direct medium would
Oh yes, I mean definitely. I mean it has many freedoms, but one of them is the freedom of time. I mean you can work on something over a period of weeks that will be delivered in 5 minutes. And,
But I wonder if the message is different. I mean, if you speak directly to an audience, you say something one way, and yet if you're writing, you have a lot more ability to say something in a different way that, while may not be immediately pleasing to them, would actually sink in more effectively.
well, of course, I have talked to live audiences.
Oh, right.
And I find that their reaction changes what I do. And I suppose that's as it should be, but when you write, you can react to what's in your own imagination. You can be your own feedback in a certain sense.
Now, is that helpful or harmful, I wonder? Does your writing suffer because you don't have the immediacy of the feedback?
Well, I think writing would suffer if you never had a reader. But I think that exploring your own imagination is a basic necessity.
Now, you belong to a writers group, speaking of feedback and that sort of thing. How does that help you? I assume it helps you.
Well, it does, and I must say, when I first joined this writers group, I'm in a group of 10 people, and we're a subset of the Washington Independent Writers. We read each other's work and comment on it in a sort of a roundtable method. We don't do anything else. I mean, we don't talk about markets, and we don't talk about how we feel, and we just read each other's work and comment on it. And when I first joined the group, I thought it was going to be painful to hear what people had to say and how they didn't like this and didn't like that, and how they would change it around. But I very quickly discovered that it was quite unpainful. It was helpful. In fact, it was as though there was a whole group of people gathered around me doing my work for me. And so as soon as I discovered how great that was, I was eager to help do it for the other people.
Scott, do you have a similar situation, or do you write alone and hand it out whole to people?
Oh, well, you always write alone. I don't let anything out of my hands until it is completed, or at least through a first draft stage. I, in fact, came directly to the taping from my once-a-month writers group. And the thing I find about them is that they test me. They ask me if what I've written really says what I think it said. That's a thing. Sometimes people can get lazy when they're alone in the room, and what I need the writers group is not to change my message, but to see if my message has come across. They can tell me that they did not like the way I said something, but they can't tell me they didn't like their point. They're there to help me say what I want to say, because in the final analysis, my writing is not a democracy. You know, I am not under the sway of anybody, and I am a dictator when it comes to what I have to say. So what I need them for is to help me test myself. Was that exactly the right word, or are you just trying to get by? That kind of thing.
Test yourself. I mean, is your writing such a part of you that it's a test of yourself? It's not just, well, this story didn't work, or is it really do you feel it more deeply than that? Is your writing so important to you that their criticism is criticism of you? Well,
number one, I consider my writing the most important thing in my life, except for my family. And what I'm trying to do with my writing is extremely important to me. I have been writing since I was 14 years old. So I'm 35 now. So that's, if I work my math right, that means I've been writing for the last 21 years, almost every day. So that is a deep part of my identity and who I am. And I think when people, I'm not hurt by criticism of my writing. I must have about 1,500 rejection slips. I have a stack that's 3 or 4 feet tall, and in there I've sold 30 short stories and a novel and so forth. A writer named Judith Eckerson, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's a horror writer, once said that sending his short stories out into the world is like going to a party. If you go to a party with 30 people at it, and you don't click with 25 of them, but you find that one special person who you have a 3-hour conversation with until 2 in the morning, you come away and say it was a good party. And that's really how I think about my writing. It doesn't matter if it goes out there and gets rejected 20 times, as long as somewhere out there is an editor who is between me and that readership that I want, and I have confidence in it. There was a story I was telling John about that had been rejected 22 times, then it got published, and now it's being reprinted in a British anthology. So who's right in the file analysis? Again, I'm the dictator of my words, so I tend to think I'm right.
You've been published in a lot of places that a lot of the people we've had on the show who publish in sort of more traditional, narrow science fiction magazines have not been. I know you talked about Pulp House, which is the literary magazine, and I guess there are a couple of others that are not just the four big tabloids or something like that. I wonder, do you enjoy that?
Well, one of the good things about the short story is that it's alive, at least in the science fiction, horror, fantasy world. I know the short story is not looked on very highly in the quote-unquote real world of literature. There aren't many magazines out where short stories can be published. There's a New Yorker and Esquire and so forth, but there's a thriving subculture in science fiction of magazines like Eldritch Tales and Death Realm and Fantasy Book and Pulp House and so forth that reaches a smaller audience. They're not publishing in the millions, but nonetheless there are people out there who are looking for it, and sometimes there are things you can do in those smaller magazines that the more mainstream ones might be a little bit fearful to deal with.
Right. The benefits of narrowcasting, something we know all about on cable television.
That's correct.
Judith, we were talking a little bit to you about, you have a similar circumstance. You published in an anthology called, I guess, The Best of Hill and Valley. You brought us a copy of that today.
Well, that's not a science fiction
But
anthology.
exactly. And as a result, you've had an audience that wouldn't necessarily pick up a copy of Analog or something like that. And you've got a story upcoming in a magazine of textiles called Threads.
Well, that's right. They occasionally published a column of humor, and I thought they might even publish a story about people who were knitted, and indeed they did.
People who are knitted?
Yes.
I have difficulty visualizing that. You have to describe it to me now.
Well, this story in particular is about a knitted man and wife, and she decides she would like to unravel him and re-knit him in a way that she would prefer.
Sounds like quite a yarn.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, yes. There's obviously a very serious message in that interesting metaphor that you use there. I wonder if you write a lot of your science fiction and fantasy and other works, not only in the genre, with a message in mind, or whether it just sometimes comes out that way?
Well, sometimes it comes out that way. I mean, it really depends on what gets me interested in the story in the first place. I've never set out to with a theme in mind and invented a story to go around it or characters to convey it. Sometimes, I mean, I remember just a scene. I was driving along a road and I saw a hill where somebody had mowed the grass down, and suddenly it looked to me as though that hill was not a natural configuration. It looked like a teacup that had been turned over. It was so perfect. And it got me to thinking about Indian mounds, and then that got me to thinking about whether Indian mounds could in fact be machinery, whether they could be time machines, and so forth and so on. You know, one idea led to another, and it wasn't a matter of having a message to convey. It was a matter of simply exploring what was possible to think.
Scott, what about you? Is your fiction there to illuminate people about a specific idea you have, or is it there to entertain, or a little of both? Or?
Well, hopefully it should do both. I mean, stories come out of the strangest places, but in the end, if they're going to work, they have to be more than just a neat idea. It has to be coupled with something I want to grab your lapels and put you down and say. There's one story of mine that just came out in a magazine, one of those small press magazines we were talking about, called Death Realm, and it's called True Love and How It Ruined My Credit Rating. And now that came about because in my real world job, I work at a bank in a mortgage department, and as such help decide who gets that home mortgage and who doesn't and so forth. Anyway, it just suddenly struck me one day that what if after I died, I were to be judged by God do the way in like the profession that I held, so that when I died, I would go to a waiting area, have a credit report run on my life, and be asked to explain all the choices I'd made. For example, if you were a talk show host, after you die, you would be before an audience and have to be interviewing people, and they'll listen to laugh, and you wait for the reviews and TV Guide next week and so forth, and that would decide whether you got into heaven or hell. Anyway, that was the basis. It started with a mortgage banker dying and being asked by God, could you please write a letter explaining why you only called your mother 4 times last year, and this, that, and the other. But it really went on to become something more. If it was just that gimmick, well, it would still be a nice, nice conceit. But it really came to the point of, gee, what would I say? How could I explain my life and the choices that I had made and so forth? And what would God expect to hear and so forth? And that's how that ended up starting, and that's what that story was about.
Another religion and science fiction story. I've just been rereading some of my old favorite authors, and I reread Clarke's The Star, which has a religious overtones, and several of the Asimov and Heinlein, and all through the genre there is this retelling of religious stories and creation of new religions and twists on old religions. I wonder, it certainly appeals to you. Is there something about religion that attracts science fiction and fantasy authors?
Well, I think one of the ways to look at it is the Bible is, aside from being a great spiritual revelation and so forth, is actually a wonderful novel with miracles happening and magic and so forth. So that reading the Bible to me as a child was as fascinating as reading a science fiction novel, taking away the element of whether this happened or not or so forth. So it's just a fascinating work. And then you get to the next aspect, which is, as far as I'm concerned, is we as authors are almost playing gods with our stories. We're trying to take pieces of a life and make sense out of it, and allowing for the existence of God that says that our lives make sense and we have a purpose and so forth. So on a number of levels, I think people have been fascinated about God and gods and so forth.
Judith, you obviously have a different different viewpoint on this, maybe the same view.
Well, I was thinking about Ira Progoff, who is a journal writing expert, who talked about his experience in World War II, where he was in some trench somewhere, listening to bombs fly overhead, and wondering what would happen if, in fact, this war went to its ultimate conclusion and destroyed civilization. In particular, he was concerned about what would happen if it destroyed all the holy books. And as he was pondering this, he came to the conclusion that what he would have to do is to write them over again. And I think that that is what a lot of people are doing, not only religious writers, but science fiction writers. They're writing them over again. I mean, expressing the spiritual life as it appears in many forms. I don't think it's enough to, take the Bible as it was. I don't think it's a novel. I think it's a collection of short stories. But to take it and say, okay, that's done. I don't think the Bible is done. I think that people have to keep on writing it.
Then is there a difference between a theologian coming to the genre, like C.S. Lewis writing a fantasy in Narnia or his space trilogy, as opposed to somebody like Ted Sturgeon or Arthur Clarke writing as a science fiction author using the images and the metaphors of the religious mythos? Is there a difference?
I think there's a difference. I mean, they may get their wires crossed in various ways. I once used Theodore Sturgeon's book of what were the book on ethics. You mentioned it before.
More Than Human?
More Than Human. Right. I used that book in a class on ethics, and I found that a number of people were interested in looking at ethics from a new point of view, but there were a couple of people who were rather offended that I suggested that they should read fiction. I mean, they said, this is trivial. fiction is by definition trivial. But it wasn't trivial to me. I think C.S. Lewis has been rightly criticized for being didactic and preachy in a lot of what he wrote. And I don't think that's good science fiction.
I think what happens with science fiction authors and with authors in general usually know no bounds. They will explore many different things, trying to figure them out for themselves. What is the relationship of man to the universe, man to God, and so forth. And sometimes in that artistic endeavor they step over the bounds. Salman Rushdie being an example. His novel is a fantasy novel, but it makes commentary on God and so forth, and a number of people have been offended by that. So many of the people who write, such as C.S. Lewis, when you say they're being didactic, many of them have a foregone conclusion and are attempting to provide a moral lesson in their fiction, where many of the people who come from the point of view of being a fiction writer are saying, well, let me just make my art and not worry about hewing to any one line, one party line, or anything like that. So I think that's the difference that I've seen as it's come about.
Judith, I'm interested in your story about using science fiction to teach ethics. I was in a discussion with somebody the other evening, a staunch defender of science fiction to the extreme. And they were saying that the rest of the literature they'd been reading dealt with internal problems, individuals' problems, and that as far as he was able to tell, science fiction was the only literature that by and large dealt with problems of the world as opposed to problems of individuals. I'm not even sure that's true. I wonder what you think about it.
Well, I don't think it's true. I think there are many forms of fiction that have dealt with large questions. But certainly science fiction in its form after, say, about 1940, 1950, has dealt a great deal with societies as a whole, or possible societies. I mean, I think that the 19th century had the utopian community as an experimental ideal, and the 20th century has science fiction that gives us many possible communities in the form of science fiction. In fact, more than we could experiment with. In reality, we can experiment with them, at least mentally, because we're given whole worlds.
I think when you get into that issue, you get to the point of what should science fiction do, as if there's something it should do or it should have an agenda to do. I know John Campbell, who edited Analog, had the feeling that science fiction had a purpose. It was to lead mankind to the technological, wonderful future that we would have. And
well, here we are.
Here we are. This is the future. We like it so far. But if you talk to people at NASA and so forth, many of them said that they got interested in rocketry and so forth from reading science fiction when younger. And these days there are, I guess, subsets of science fiction that want us to do that want us to say, gee, the future will be a wonderful place and we should make many more neat new toys and so forth, and tell people that the future will be wonderful and so forth. And I think within science fiction there are differing schools of people. Some say, you know, we're here to tell what is going to happen, and other people are saying, well, we should lead people before us. And when you get to that point of view with using science fiction to propagandize for L5 space stations and so forth, rather than paying attention to the story and the people and the characters, I think you get in trouble there.
Well, there is certainly a difference between attempting feverishly to predict the future and following your own path. Maybe, in fact, you would end up being a leader.
I wonder if science fiction isn't a little bit reactive. I mean, in John Campbell's day, a lot of people who weren't writing science fiction looked to technology to solve the world's problems. We were not going to have war anymore, to use the negative example, because the technology was so horrible, and on the good side, the technology was going to extend our lives and this sort of thing. And I think now science fiction has changed to a more societal impact, and maybe that's because society as a whole is more concerned with how we interact with each other.
Well, that's possibly true, but it's also true that the sort of the nuts and bolts science fiction stories were often proven to be ridiculous within a very short number of years. So maybe it's safer as science fiction writers to talk about large societal evolution.
Well, you take a look at William Gibson's Neuromancer, and one of the things that that says is the future is not going to be all beautiful and clean and chrome and looking like the World's Fair exhibit that we saw when we were kids. The future is going to be like inner city New York, perhaps, with people making use of the technology the way they want, with hackers all over the place, plugging into computers and so forth. So when we get into what should science fiction do, there are people who do say, no, tell them it's going to be beautiful and it'll all work out and everything will be fine. But, you know, well, they say technology finds its own uses on the street, I think.
Well, does science fiction have a purpose? Have you found that it's influenced sort of your thinking of the future, or do you just kind of go along and regardless of your profession as a writer of science fiction, think about it pretty much the same way your neighbors do you think?
Well, I think I can look back at individual works of science fiction and say, yes, some works of fiction have specifically changed the way I think about certain things. And not to mention Stranger in a Strange Land again, but I will. He had a concept in there which I think they were called true witnesses. I don't know if you remember that. And if you said to one of them, could you look at that house over there and tell me what color it is, they would say, well, it's green on this side. Because it would teach them that you know, you have to be careful about what you say and what you think, and think carefully about things, and things may not be as they seem. So just that small little fragment of a minor character in a science fiction novel came about and had an effect on some of the ways I think about things and the way I examine ideas and issues. And I'm sure I could come up with many others if we had time and I could think back, but that's just one example.
Judith, does science fiction influence your view of the world, or do you influence?
Yes, I think it does, and it has some relation to what I said before about these nuts and bolts science fiction stories being proved wrong so soon. When I read the newspapers and I hear political people predicting how things are going to be in 10 years or 20 years or in the even nearer future, I'm aware, because I have read a lot of science fiction and a lot about science fiction, that our view of the past is marvelous and our view of the future is very poor. I mean, it is very difficult to predict things. And so I don't take this stuff about prediction so seriously.
Well, I had an idea for a story which I'm never going to write, so I throw it open to whoever wants to, including the audience. But imagine a year ago someone writing a science fiction story in which they said the Berlin Wall was going to come down and the two Germanys were going to be reunited. I had this image of this frustrated writer trying to sell this story, and everyone writing back saying, dear writer, this is the most ridiculous thing I have ever seen in my life. So, you know, to talk about what we can predict or not predict, no one would have predicted that a year ago. So people who say, well, science fiction's purpose is to predict the future, I don't know. I think science fiction, like all literature, is here to help me figure out who I am right now.
Your prediction, then, is that the future will be unpredictable.
Unpredictable,
yes.
So it may make us have open minds.
You know, that's true. That's true. Well, some people say the past is unpredictable, but I don't know.
Before we leave, I want to talk quickly about you folks. You have upcoming works. Scott, you said you had a novel coming out.
Yes, my first novel will be out, pub date July. It's called The Gift. It's published by Space and Time. It's one of the smaller presses. They publish a novel every few months and so forth, and I'm sure it can be found in your better science fiction and specialty bookshops.
Good, good. That's your first novel. We'll see a lot more from you.
Novel.
Judith, you've got a new story coming out from Threads, and is there anything you're working on right now?
The story is called Knit Thyself. I'm working on a number of stories. I have a novella finished, which is called Starfish, and as I said to you before, it's been accepted by 2 small presses, which have subsequently gone bankrupt. So I'm looking for another.
Okay, well, any small presses out there who want a good story, they can contact you, care of the show, and we will ship your work off to them immediately. And I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you all for watching. It's been another episode of Fast Forward. Join us again next month, please.